The people die so that now it seems they are obliged to carry the dead to be buried by daylight, the nights not sufficing to do so. How empty the streets are and melancholy, so many poor, sick in the streets full of sores, and so many sad stories overheard as I walk, everyone talking of this dead and that man sick. Thus this month ends with great sadness upon the public through the greatness of the plague. Everywhere throughout the kingdom almost. Every day sadder and sadder news of its increase. In the city this week died 7,496, of them 6,102 of the plague. But it is feared that the true number of the dead this week is near 10,000, partly from the poor that cannot be taken notice of through the greatness of that number, and partly from the Quakers and others that will not have any bell ring for them. Those harrowing words were taken from the diary of Samuel Pepys, who lived in London during the Great Plague year of 1665, and dutifully catalogued the world crumbling around him. The year prior, a comet appeared in the sky, and stargazing Londoners began to worry what that divine sign might portend. Then, in April 1665, a few people in the suburb of St. Giles came down with a somewhat baffling illness. Some developed painfully enlarged lymph nodes in their necks or groins, called buboes, which would then rupture, releasing black pus and a foul stench into the air. Others developed primary respiratory symptoms, coughing for a day or two before blood began to pour from their orifices, heralding the nearing end. And others still seemingly died without warning, becoming ill and succumbing to illness, all within a single day. These were the most mysterious and terrifying of all. Though it was obvious at first that the poorest classes seemed to be hardest hit, no one knew the cause of this pestilence, resulting in an increasing feeling of panic. Some thought it was spread by miasma or bad air. Others absolutely knew that, as is so often the case with great plagues of history, this was merely the punishment of a righteous God for the deeds of the sinful. Those in the upper classes who could flee the city, including King Charles II himself, did. Those who could not were left to their fate. Into this void of uncertainty came plenty of well-meaning citizens and charlatans alike, medical and otherwise. Plague doctors, known to the FromSoft community from their characteristic mask which served as the inspiration for the attire in Demon Souls' Valley of Defilement, worked to halt the spread of the disease and dispose of the dead, but nothing reliably worked. In April 1665, an ominous sign appeared, a few names listed on the now famous Bills of Mortality, with the cause of death simply listed as plague. By the height of the epidemic, in September of that same year, more than 7,000 Londoners were dying each week of plague. All told, between 70,000 and 100,000 souls perished in the Great Plague of London alone, amounting to roughly a quarter of the city's population. The epidemic ebbed and flowed through the first half of the following year, 1666. Then, shockingly, cruelly, a second calamity struck. On an early autumn night, a fire, which began in a baker's shop, began spreading in the old city. It quickly grew beyond anyone's control, owing to that classic combination of bad luck and unpreparedness. It burned for 4 days straight, and by the time the fire subsided, it had destroyed roughly 15,000 houses and 80 churches and cathedrals. The majority of the destruction was in the old city, the part of London that lay within the grand old city walls, built by the Romans when the city was an imperial outpost known as Londinium. And then something rather baffling occurred. As the wreckage from the fire was cleaned up and the old city rebuilt, Londoners noticed that there were fewer people becoming infected with plague. Though modern scholarship doubts the causal relationship to the terrified city folk at the time, and for centuries after, it appeared as if the Great Fire of London had halted the spread of the plague. What strange fate indeed that such a terrible calamity could be divine salvation rather than further punishment. The great conflagration had evidently cleansed the impurity of the city, and the lesson of this purifying power of flame was not lost on writers and observers at the time. As it turns out, the plague has been with us since pretty much the beginning. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes the plague, has been identified on teeth from skeletons dating to roughly 4,000 years ago. Many plagues have struck human civilization throughout our history, from the Plague of Athens, likely smallpox based on Thucydides' descriptions, to the numerous plagues and pestilences attested to in the Hebrew Bible. But the plague, meaning the one caused by Yersinia pestis, which comes in the horrible flavors of bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic, made its first proper entry into the world stage during the reign of the Roman Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD, and killed somewhere between 25 and 50 million people throughout the empire. It recurred in waves over the next 2 centuries, and then it disappeared just as mysteriously as it had appeared, laying dormant for 8 centuries when the absolute world-altering catastrophe, known to us simply as the Black Death, struck, once again heralded by celestial phenomena, in this case a rare planetary conjunction. There really is no way to properly convey the scale of destruction this pandemic wrought, so perhaps all we can do is compare. COVID-19, a world-altering epic, no doubt, killed less than 1% of infected individuals. The Spanish flu of 1918, such a great catastrophe that had ended World War I and in many locales took more lives than the Great War itself, had a mortality rate of somewhere between 1 and 5%. The Black Death killed fully 1/3 of the entire population of Europe in a 5-year period. Many towns were simply erased from existence in the span of a single year. The devastation caused such a warping of the social fabric that roving, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic mobs, known as flagellants, patrolled the streets like a Yharnamite mob, even burning some of their victims alive. It was a calamity on a scale never seen before or since. As a contemporary chronicle puts it, quote, "A great mortality destroyed more than 1/3 of the men, women, and children. Alas, this mortality devoured such a multitude of both sexes that no one could be found to carry the bodies of the dead to burial. But men and women carried the bodies of their own little ones to church on their shoulders, and threw them into the mass graves, from which arose such a stink that it was barely possible for anyone to go past the churchyard." End quote. After the Black Death, Yersinia lay mostly dormant for a few centuries, until the third and final Great Pandemic, of which the Great Plague of London was just a small part. These are the cycles of plague throughout history, periods of peaceful coexistence punctuated by waves of utter destruction. During these glorious periods of respite, plague fell out of living memory and became more of a folktale than a fact of life. Children's songs were sung about the olden days of plague. People lived their lives in blissful ignorance of the looming threat. And, to quote Tolkien, some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. In Bloodborne, the city of Yharnam we explore is befouled by a mysterious plague. But this current scourge is just the latest in a cycle of inexplicably devastating plagues that have ravaged the civilizations of this world. Loran, Old Yharnam, now Upper Yharnam, all succumbed in one form or another to plague. With each iteration, the afflicted turn to the heavens, or to the cosmos, to understand the calamity, and to seek divine reprieve. Just like in the real world, some try to stop its power with prayer, or with aromatic fragrances, others with scientific experiment, and still others by hunting down and exterminating the afflicted. Most desperate of all, the hunters even tried to halt the plague's spread by burning down the old city, echoing the Great Fire of London. During one of these cycles of plagues, a religion was founded, centered on the mother of a divine child, and the use of miraculously healing blood to treat the illness. That is the story we will tell today. Last time, we introduced the Madonna character from the triad of iconography borrowed from real-world Christianity, namely the Annunciation, Nativity, and Pietà, all three phases of a mother's relationship with her supernatural and tragically short-lived child. If you haven't watched that video, we recommend you do so now, since we'll be building upon that analysis. From her numerous depictions throughout Yharnam, we know that the Madonna character is of extreme importance to the old religion of Yharnam. This woman went on to bear the child of a great one and found a religion, becoming the Queen Mother. Madonna, mother of the old church. But what were the tenets of this old faith? Why did the people worship this woman specifically? Well, we would propose that the answer is contained within the remaining iconography of that stratum, some of which we've touched upon already. Flanking the Madonna character in the Yharnam lintel are two identical depictions of a man, wrapped in bandages, hooded, and holding his hands in supplication. Notably, this figure appears to have messengers at his feet. If you think about it, you've seen this depiction probably hundreds of times, because it's replicated in statue form dozens and dozens of times throughout the city. If we take a closer look at these, we can see that the principal features of this character are the bandaged limbs, masked face, and the messengers. This man is sick. He holds his hands in front of his face as if he is terrified at what he's become. His body is hunched and contorted painfully. He is covered in bandages, and his face is covered in an attempt to protect him from whatever disease is spreading amongst his people. The general thematic content, if perhaps not its visual form, of the statue evokes the famous plague columns erected throughout Europe after the devastation of the Third Pandemic, the one during which London's Great Plague occurred. These columns were celebrations of salvation from the plague, erected after it ended. And the iconography is clear enough, usually with the sick of humanity being saved by angels, and ultimately God. Among the most famous of these columns, the Plague Column in Vienna, erected in 1667, has a pretty clear message: that the catastrophe of the plague was only ended by the piety of King Leopold. In this way, it is sort of a victory column, memorializing the dead while also claiming victory over the plague. It is a tale as old as time, and attested to quite clearly in the Bible or in the records of the Justinianic plague, that plagues are often interpreted as divine judgment, and reprieve from plague likewise as divine salvation. Lest you think this is all just ancient history, our more modern pandemics, say HIV/AIDS or COVID-19, are unfortunately often interpreted as moral judgments upon the afflicted. And those afflicted and their supporters often take to making monuments in solidarity with the dead, just like the plague columns of the medieval world. And at the height of the recent COVID pandemic in 2020, residents of Vienna flocked to their city's plague column, seeking divine protection just as they did back in the 17th century. As it turns out, Yharnam does have a plague column in the Grand Cathedral, but we'll return to that one at the end. For now, if we take a look back at our statue in Yharnam, we can see similar ideas to the European plague memorials, with the sick man being saved, this time by messengers instead of angels. Save for the messengers, this statue is of a similar ilk to those found throughout Yharnam, in particular in Old Yharnam and the processional ways of the cathedral ward, which depict cloaked figures with their faces covered to prevent transmission of an unknown illness. Even if you don't know the specific story of these statues, these forms undoubtedly evoke tragedy and illness. But this man is different. He has the messengers on his side. By the way, the Greek word for message is angelos, so messengers and angels are literally synonymous, which makes sense as both canonically help transport you to other realms, only that in Bloodborne, the messengers are chthonic, not heavenly. As Charred Thermos has pointed out, the messengers are pretty clearly dead children in the mythology of Bloodborne's world, and in fact, there may be some real-world parallel to that. Cherubic angels, the ones that look like infants and appear all over post-Renaissance art, including plague columns, are never described as such anywhere in the Bible, and may have been a stylistic manifestation of high infant mortality during later medieval times, especially in times of plague. So returning to our sick man statue, we see he is being attended to by the messengers. It's no real mystery, though, what is really saving him. It's the healing blood. Yharnam is the home of blood ministration, as our introductory scene tells us, and innumerable people have flocked to the city to cure the incurable. Take Gilbert, for example.
Oh, you must be a hunter, and not one from around here either. I'm Gilbert, a fellow outsider. What afflicted me was incurable, but this town gave me hope. Their strange blood bought me time. I was most fortunate, unharmed by the plague of beasts. I can even die human.
This too has its roots in the real world, as the very first successful transfusion, performed between two dogs by Richard Lower in London in 1665, the very same time and place as the Great Plague of London. The following year, the French physician Jean-Baptiste Denis performed the first successful transfusion between an animal and a man, a topic we will discuss further in a later episode. Point is, there is some fascinating history connecting plague and blood transfusions. By the way, in case you were wondering, the first successful human-to-human transfusion was performed over 100 years later in London to treat postpartum hemorrhage. Childbirth and blood transfusions have a deeply intertwined history. In the case of Yharnam, partaking in the blood means, among other things, seeing the messengers. Indeed, our own character, after being transfused with Yharnam blood, has a vision of the messengers saving us from a beast. The metaphorical significance of this scene is clear enough, the dual paths of man into either cosmic enlightenment or beasthood, but for our purposes here, the idea is that receiving the blood allows you to see the messengers. While this may seem a bit overgeneralized, how else to explain the myriad messenger statues found all throughout Yharnam? Clearly, messengers are not some hidden facet of Yharnamite life. Messengers are inextricably part of Yharnam culture, and specifically, they are associated with healing blood transfusions. And so it's telling, then, that they appear on the base of this sick man statue. As we know from the lintel we analyzed last episode, these figures are part of an iconographic set with the Madonna, and so they tell us something about the old religion of Yharnam. It's kind of obvious in retrospect, but this was a religion centered on the use of healing blood to treat victims of the plague. Yharnam had a healing church long before Lawrence showed up. The only question is, where did they get the blood? What we've said so far is that the old religion of Yharnam appears to be focused on the character of the Madonna, mother of a divine child, and the use of healing blood. So what is the relationship between these two? How does blood ministration relate to the birth of an infant Great One? We would propose they are directly related. On the one hand, consumption of blood leads some women to become supernaturally pregnant. This is most obviously true in the case of Queen Annalise, who consumes blood drag in an attempt to impregnate herself with the child of blood. But it may also be true in Queen Yharnam's and Yosefka's supernatural pregnancies. But that still doesn't answer the question of where does the sacred healing blood come from? Well, we would propose it comes from the blood of a god, just like the Christian practice of communion. Even a cursory stroll through the chalice dungeons of Thurmuru reveals that this ancient civilization had a bit of a blood fetish, to say the least. The catacombs are littered with evidence of a mass blood extraction process. Most obviously, the hanging bodies used to exsanguinate the blood donors, let's just call them blood donors, in much the same way you'd bleed livestock before butchering it. This was such an important facet of Thumerian society that it literally became their symbol. The hunter's mark, which we are told signifies hunters today, is found all throughout the chalice dungeons. What it clearly shows is a body being hung for exsanguination. This is its original meaning. Only later did the symbol come to specifically mean hunter. We'll talk more about the evolution of runic meanings in a later episode. These practices of exsanguination and blood harvesting have continued through modern-day Yharnam, with blood donors, or as they came to be called, blood saints, like Adeline and even the prostitute Ariana, who clearly donate their own blood for us to consume. But even these blood saints, like Adele and Adeline, are said to be selected on the basis of their ability to serve as, quote, vessels for blood, end quote. And Adeline's blood vial in particular states that, quote, Adeline was originally one of the blood saints who received treatment by the church to cultivate worthy blood. Adeline's was one of the few cases that turned out favorably, end quote. Meaning that though they now provide a proximal source of blood, ultimately their power comes from already having been transfused by the old blood, with which they are evidently especially compatible. Even the hanged man for exsanguination makes a return in Old Yharnam. And the most highly prized blood of all is the incoagulable blood, or the oozing blood, as Odin's rune puts it. Blood that doesn't coagulate will keep for a long time after the death of the body, or even after it is harvested. This was a major limitation in the real world to the implementation of transfusion medicine, as extracted blood would just clot in whatever container it was held in for storage. That is, until the development of EDTA and other anticoagulants. Of course, this highly prized, special, non-clotting blood, which is apparently a heritable trait of some Thumerians, is also a little wink and a nod from the developers at the real-world disorder of hemophilia, which causes an inability to form clots and therefore can lead to dangerous and often fatal hemorrhages. This disease famously affected several members of Queen Victoria's family, including the last crown prince of Tsarist Russia, so much so that it became literally known as Royal's disease. So blood that lacks the normal ability to clot, being seen as a marker of a royal lineage, is quite spot on. To summarize, the source of regular old healing blood is just the blood of Yharnamites. But the truly sacred blood, the old blood, well, that is something else entirely. Much of what we know about the old blood comes from somewhat suspect sources, like the wannabe executioner Alfred. He tells us,
Byrgenwerth is an old place of learning, and the Tomb of the Gods, carved out below Yharnam, should be familiar to every hunter. Well, once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb. This led to the founding of the Healing Church and the establishment of blood healing.
Dubious source aside, Alfred paints a pretty clear picture. The old blood was found by Byrgenwerth scholars in the Pthumerian catacombs, and its discovery fractured the scholars and led to the foundation of the Healing Church. Undoubtedly, the flashback scene we see when we touch Lawrence's skull. So far, this is all pretty well-known stuff, but what actually is the old blood? It comes from Thumeru, but what makes it so special? In Christianity, specifically the older, more traditional denominations like Catholicism, the sacrament of communion, also known as receiving the Eucharist, is the act of consuming the body and blood of Jesus Christ. This is not a figure of speech. This is taken quite literally, that by the process of blessing the hitherto unremarkable bread and wine, they literally become, in their essence, if not their form, the body and blood of Jesus. As Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians puts it, quote, "The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ?" End quote. Put yourself in the shoes of, I don't know, just for example, a middle-aged Japanese game developer upon first learning about this practice. It's a little bizarre, isn't it? To literally eat the body of your God, to literally drink his blood. The Romans certainly thought so, which is why in the early days of Christianity, before Emperor Constantine's conversion, one of the most common accusations against the Christians was that they were cannibals. In any event, it's not hard to imagine the creative genesis of the idea for Bloodborne's old blood, born from this notion of communion. Of course, it's no accident that this specific word is used, and the Healing Church is even represented by the communion rune, and taken to an absurd conclusion. Instead of consuming transubstantiated bread and wine, in Bloodborne, the adherents of the Healing Church are literally consuming blood of their gods, which they found in the Chalice dungeons. And this practice started all the way back in Thumeru. Which brings us, finally, back to the Madonna and the old religion of Yharnam. Perhaps the divine child shown in the nativity scene, and later after his death in the Pietà, was the source of the sacred blood during that time. Perhaps that is even why the Pthumerians, in their time, wanted their queen to bear the child of the Great One in the first place, so that they would have a source of this supernatural blood. We don't know whether the blood is harvested directly from an infant Great One, but it seems more likely that the mother is the source. In the real world, when a mother carries a child in her womb, some of that child's DNA actually mixes with the mother's blood, such that fetal DNA can be detected from a maternal blood draw. This phenomenon is actually the basis for modern prenatal genetic testing. So perhaps, likewise, in Bloodborne's world, carrying an infant Great One in her womb actually confers a supernatural quality to the woman's blood. This would explain, if it happened in Thumeru, why Pthumerian blood is so highly prized by both humans and Great Ones, because it still contains traces of this quality. Queen Annalise accepts us into her covenant by sharing her own blood, which we consume.
If thou wouldst this path walk, I prithee, partake of my rotted blood. Very well. Drink deep of our blood.
So one can only assume it worked much the same way with Queen Yharnam in Thumeru, and the Madonna thereafter. After becoming impregnated with a special child, her blood is now the source of supernatural power, and can be shared with her subjects. It's no coincidence that a variation of the sick man statue can be found all throughout Thumaru. As we know, just like in our world, previous cycles of plague have devastated the ancient civilizations of Bloodborne. And so it's no surprise that the people of Thumaru would seek miraculous healing blood as well. Whether that blood provides salvation or only further descent into madness is a topic for another day. In this context, the replacement of all Madonna iconography in the cathedral ward makes much more sense. She was the original source of the sacred blood in Yharnam, but she has been supplanted by a new source. After they found the old blood in the chalices, Lawrence became the source of healing blood, which explains why the Yharnamites, famously xenophobic, accepted these outsiders from Bergenworth into their midst. Although Lawrence is not physically the source of the old blood, rather he is harvesting it from the subterranean tombs beneath the city, essentially feeding Yharnam's old blood back to it. As Gehrman says, quote, "A holy chalice will reveal the tomb of the gods, where hunters partake in communion," end quote, making it quite clear that the practice of communion is inextricable from the chalice dungeons. The fact that we find the Thumaru chalice in Old Yharnam, in the Church of the Good Chalice, tells us that the people that worshipped the Madonna clearly believed in communion in the chalice dungeons. And all throughout the cathedral ward, the Madonna iconography has been systematically removed, leaving very little trace of her former prominence as bestower of blood. In the interior of the cathedral ward and its upper echelons, the iconography shifts even further away from these healing tropes, to the arcane, to depicting that which only those with sufficient insight can see. Amygdala statues, mini ebrietuses, even the moon presence itself. But that is not what the common people care about. They care about the miraculous healing blood, which is why their statues show the Madonna and her child, and the sick man being healed. This distinction between folk religion and doctrinal Gnostic religion is central to the modern-day duality of the healing church. To the people, it appears to be a distributor of the sacred healing blood, but to its ministers, it is known to be a place of eldritch experimentation. Of course, the irony of all of that is, contrary to their hopes for salvation through blood, the common folk of Yharnam are not saved from the beast plague by the healing blood. Instead, their transformation is only hastened by it. The idea that a blood transfusion could change something fundamental, even animalistic, about your nature is one with quite ancient roots, but that will have to wait for an upcoming episode. But not all Madonna iconography has been purged from the cathedral ward. There is a single lingering depiction, and it's a grand one. The ancient altar of the Grand Cathedral shows a prominent female character, likely the Madonna, hooded the way that she is in her depictions on the Great Bridge, pouring out a blessed liquid for the imploring masses. Don't even get us started on libations. If you need your libation fix, you can watch our Elden Ring content on the matter. But here, there should be no mystery as to what this sacred liquid is. It's the healing blood, which the Madonna is bestowing upon her devoted flock. This is Yharnam's proper plague column, with the same tiered iconography as the real-world European versions, showing the lower human tiers being saved by the higher, more divine ones. This, our friends, is classic iconographic replacement. The altar of the Grand Cathedral was clearly built back in the time of the Madonna. Only precious few hidden remnants remain to tell the story of her role here. But while the people may have forgotten her, her story is still told in stone. When Lawrence and company moved in, while they left much of the blood healing iconography, all of the sick man statues and the statues of plagued commoners, what they replaced specifically was the role of the Madonna. This magnificent Madonna sculpture, which we know from the concept art how it originally looked, has been beheaded. no more Madonna, and in her place, there's a skull of the new source of blood, the one mining Yharnam's subterranean past for its old blood. Lawrence. In all likelihood, at the time of the old religion of Yharnam, it was a place of a shared culture with Cainhurst, one centered around mothers of divine children and the use of miraculous healing blood, which would certainly help to explain the Cainhurst sigils in Yharnam, and the presence of the Pietà altar in Hemwick, which is basically the crossroads between the castle and the city. And so in this context, Annalise's obsession with creating a child of blood makes a bit more sense. It's not just for the bragging rights of producing a supernatural child, but it is literally the source of her power, the source of the old blood. Or at least, it was. That is, until Lawrence created the executioners, invaded the castle, and abducted the child of blood, the true origin story of the Healing Church Hunters. But that is a story for another day.